Why do you have knee pain? The most important thing to recognize here is the knee is the middle link. It's often the thing that pays the price for the joint above and the joint below. But we can get really hyper fixated on the joint where the pain is, even though we really need to address problems at other joints. Now, that's not to say that we can't actually injure the knee itself. You can get a bunch of injuries here, right? Like we can tear the meniscus, generally from trying to do some level of rotation while the knee is flexed, and that tear can lead to a block in your movement capacity. You can tear a bunch of the ligaments around the knee, so like the medial collateral ligament, which prevents medial movement of the knee, or the lateral collateral ligament, which prevents lateral movement of the knee, or the posterior collateral lateral ligament, which prevents posterior movement. And those structures are all really important, and if we're getting pain in any of those motions, or we're getting too much range of motion in one of those directions, pretty good indicator that one of those structures could be injured. For example, with the posterior collateral lateral ligament. And none of that's good. It means that we're going to have excess range of motion, lack of stability, right? So yes, we can have an injury there, but why did it occur in the first place? Hypothetically, yeah, you could have an isolated issue. It could be like trauma directly to the knee. It could be way too much load, but also, we get way too much load due to, again, issues at those other joints. For example, something that you might see a lot of with like young basketball players is they get this like weird, like bony protrusion below their knee. It's like, what is that? It's called Osgood-Schlatter. Basically what's happening is that if you're doing a lot of running and jumping, you get a bunch of quad activation, and that quad inserts into the patella tendon. As a result, we can get some inflammation and hypertrophy around the tibial tuberosity. So this big tuberosity, this big growth at the top of the tibia, big bone of the lower leg. So yes, we're producing an issue at the knee, but really it was a result of the movement we were doing and of the hyper stimulation of the quad. Speaking of the quads, we could have other sorts of issues if they weren't activating correctly. So for example, the quads are responsible for descent into like a squat, for example, as well as eccentric activation for load absorption. So if we don't correctly activate the quads, we're going to have way too much load go through the body, for example, to the patella tendon or to any of those other structures that I mentioned. And if they're not firing properly, we're not going to have a good activation pattern if we are descending into some sort of athletic posture. If we move slightly up to the rest of the hip and look at the glutes, we get another answer for how we can address some pain. So when you're walking is actually like a relatively asymmetrical task. There's an asymmetric load on the medial, so inner side of the knee, and most people tolerate that relatively well, but some people won't, or for some sort of reason the mechanics might be off, it might just be how they are. And if that's the case, we can develop arthritis on the medial side. When that happens, we really want to strengthen the glute max and the TFL. This sort of prevents that sort of inward bearing force, or at least sort of lessens it, so that we can have a more balanced distribution of force across the knee. If we look at the femur generally, if it's internally rotated by an extra 5 degrees, which really isn't too much movement, it's going to increase contact pressure on the cartilage of the knee by 26%. So that's a massive, like 5-fold increase in pressure from that little bit of rotation. And so again, we're getting an idea that movement above the joint is causing issues at the joint. What about below the joint? So let's look at the ankle or foot. So if we want to decrease the rates of like patella tendinopathy, right, we can actually increase our ankle dorsiflexion. The rationale here is that if you reduce ankle dorsiflexion capability, you reduce load-bearing capability of the plantar flexors. So it makes your like toe point basically. Not a good thing, so we want to increase it so it's more capable of bearing loads, similar to the quads. And for a really good example of like the domino effect, we could have knee pain due to an excessively internally rotated tibia, so the big bone in our lower leg, and we could say that's an issue. Why is that happening? And then you could look at the foot, and what you'd see is the subtalar joint. So it's one of the main bones that sort of supports the whole weight of your leg and then transfers into the foot. If that pronates too much, so sort of flattens onto the ground too much in the early or mid phase of walking, it's going to internally rotate the tib, which is going to put too much strain on the knee and cause injury. And I think when we get a really overarching picture of where things go wrong in the knee is in hyperextension of the knee. So lots of things could be contributing to this. I'm not going to tell you it's one particular factor, right? But in hyperextension, basically your knees are locked out and they're kind of bending out the back, right? This isn't great. We're putting a lot of load on the ligaments, those passive structures, which we really don't want to stretch a ligament. So if we do that, We're stretching the ligament, we're stretching the posterior capsule of the knee, which is a ligamentous structure, which is meant to provide stability and prevent movement. Our ankles are going to be kind of plantar flexed, again, toes kind of pointed. It's not in dorsiflexion, which, as we discussed before, less load bearing capability. It's going to be a sort of mixed effect on the hip flexors and the knee flexors, in that we're going to probably have like weak quads, potentially weak hamstrings as well. We're getting a mixture of effects at different joints and at different structures in our joints. The one strange feature that does seem to be almost inherently the knee is screw home rotation. So if you want full extension of the knee, which is very important, basically in that last bit of extension, we need about 10 degrees of external rotation. But interestingly, like, you can't divorce those two movements. You can't like have external rotation and extension. Like this extra bit, I think it's coming from the knee, like so like tibial rotation. There's not like a normal external rotation coming from the hip. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've been learning all of this and more as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I do 50 minutes of exercise and read 50 pages of a physio book in a day in attempts to rehab myself. This is actually day 50, so the last day, and I'll just jump into the exercise portion of things before we wrap up. Jumping into the seated good morning. So last night my psoas was a bit sore, so I stretched it out a bit. I'm curious if this actually improved the good morning, because it was seemingly a bit better. There were some reps where I was getting this sort of lack of tension, and as I would describe it, as a strumming across my hamstrings, where it feels like lots of integrated tension, all of a sudden the tension's somewhere else, which I don't like. And that hamstring strumming actually disappeared when I focused on pushing my hamstrings back. Plus, I got a really lovely sensation through the erector spinae, so the muscles that go right along the spine, which is really what I'm chasing. So that all went quite well. Looking at my wrist, I've been doing the dart throwers motion, which is meant to be like really helpful for rehab. It has had some cracking when doing this, but I've been doing controlled articular rotations, joint movements, as a way to sort of help my wrist and get some life and health back into it, and this did help reduce some of the cracking, which is awesome. Also, after doing those movements, I felt like I wasn't hyperextending through my elbows as much like a bird dog, because it felt like I had like a more integrated tension through, like, say, the brachioradialis, which is like one of the forearm muscles, like into like my bicep basically. Yeah, just like more integration through my hand, which is something I'm not really familiar with, like working up to my shoulder, so that's actually quite cool. And yeah, just in general, pushing through my hands then, which is often something that triggers a lot of wrist pain for me, didn't hurt as much. So I think that's all a really good sign for that dart throwers motion. Really quickly, as I discussed yesterday, glute bridge, I'm kind of smashing. That's sick. I know it's a pretty easy movement, but I really struggled with it previously. So it's not hamstring dominant. I'm getting the glutes firing. Sick. With the bird dog, if anybody who's watched any of these videos before, you know that I've started hyperextending through my spine, not intentionally, and I've had a lot of trouble fixing this. Now, one thing don't think I really discussed too much is that I've essentially cut the bird dog out because of this, and I was worried that it was hurting my spine. Today, I just brought it back. I honestly didn't really care if I was hyperextending. I wasn't trying to do it. I was trying to prevent it for the most part, but I just wanted that sensation back that I've chased, which is like a lovely activation through the low back that makes me feel better. It reduces my pain. I did that and felt nice. I still don't have a great answer for how to reduce that hyperextension. It's something I've worked on a bit, and I will get there. But for today, I just needed that sensation. And really quickly on the ankle, just doing calf raises and Patrick steps, it has been a very shaky movement for me, but I'm continuing to reduce that shake. I feel like I'm getting stronger, which is awesome. And yeah, that is about it for day 50 and the challenge. I set out to do the 50 pages a day, so 2,500 pages of physio and exercise content, which is ridiculous. I don't know if it sounds like a lot, but these are textbooks, they're dense, they're big, it's so jargon heavy, it's been a lot to get through. I got in a bit of a groove with it, but geez, it's a lot to write all that down and to do video stuff and process what you're learning and to do the exercise stuff on top of it. So look, honestly, I doubt anyone's really watched everything, doubt anyone's watched much, but frankly, I did this series for me and to prove where I've come from, how I've tried to address my issues, and I'm going to keep going, not in the same challenge, but I'm going to heal myself. I know that. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in another type of video. Cheers.